In my column this week, I'm looking at the technicalities of generational research. We first need to be clear what we actually want to achieve with generational data. If we want to achieve insights into the values of a generation, we want to use the approach that the Pew Research Center out of Washington, D.C. uses, where the generations differ a bit in size because we want to more closely match generations to specific values, to specific world events that might have shaped generations in their formative years, which are usually the late teens, early 20s. Or if we want to show hard, strong numbers about generations in the housing market, in the workforce, then it is more useful to actually make each generation the same size, usually 18-year brackets. That's the approach that I personally use most often, because I quite often want to share information about generations in the workforce or on the housing market, and there the 18-year approach is actually more precise. Because if you say, a generation has that much percentage in the housing market and this other generation has much less percentage ownership of the housing market, if one generation is 20 years and the other generation 15 years, of course there will be a difference. So why do we actually bother looking at generational data? Isn't that just a weird bunch of generalizations about big groups of people? Well, yes and no. Really, we're looking at two main data sets when we look at generational data in the first place. The first one is the life stage. Every generation always goes through somewhat the same life stages, and they do it in their own style, if you will. Of course, everybody is born at the same age, and then generations roughly move through school, higher education, renting phase in their early 20s, home ownership phase, early careers in their 20s and 30s, family formation, potentially divorce, retirement and death, or somewhat along these lines. So the life stage or the life stage model is pretty similar across the generations. And so each of those generations will move through those life stages with their own set of values. And the values that a generation has and through which a generation views the world really is linked to the technology of their formative years. What are the cultural, realities that they grew up in? What are the TV shows they watched? What are the big, fat geopolitical events that shaped their worldview? These things, and of course the technological environment. These kind of environmental factors, they really shape in a big way how people think as a group. There are, of course, massive differences in any given generation. So that's the argument of why we look at generations. And then it's really interesting to see that each generation, simply because they are in a certain stage of the life cycle, they dominate certain corners, segments of society. Gen X, a very small generation, they really dominate the top leadership age at the moment. In Australia, all premiers and the Prime Minister are Gen X. New South Wales just ruined this by putting a millennial into the top job. But that said, Gen X dominates top leadership. The millennials are by far the biggest generation in the workforce. So we dominate the workforce. The baby boomers, they still dominate company boards, and they will soon dominate the retirement market. So there's a whole market that needs to shift because a new group of people with a new set of values enters the market. So that's the rough argument about generational research. In the next four columns, I will actually explore our four largest generations in more detail, so we understand who is making up Australia and how this will be shifting over the coming, let's say, 10 years or so. As always, if you found this interesting, please subscribe to this channel, and I linked below to the article that has 3 interesting charts showing big picture data about the generations as well.